Hi, this is Dr. Sato. In this lecture, we'll talk about the athlete monitoring. We have a series of information about how to monitor athletes to establish the baseline and then also see the progression of each athlete. This is a unique lecture that we cover a lot of stuff on how to monitor athletes, and it's easy to escape from a lot of important information. So we'll cover each one in detail. The first lecture, we're going to introduce the concepts of athlete monitoring. It is hard to understand why we monitor and how we actually monitor the athletes from the baseline standpoint to progression model. So we're going to cover the conceptual first, and then we move on to more practical information. This figure probably easy to understand how we actually create the monitoring process. For example, a lot of time in a traditional setting, you have a coach and an athlete with training stimulus, whether it's the weight training or team practice or individual practice. But what we can give to the coach is from various information to provide back to the coaches to understand how athletes are doing. For example, we have recovery and adaptation. We can always measure something in a daily basis to see how much they can recover and then how much they adapt to the training stimulus. And then the second one, we can also monitor the physical and then physiological adaptation. And then this one, we don't need to do it in daily manner, but we can measure it periodically. And then we can also measure the skill component as well, how the adaptation of recovery or from the physical and then physiological changes influence the skill level. And then last one, of course, is the performance. We have to measure performance, and the performance is what it matters. But if athletes are over fatigued or chronically fatigued, then they cannot perform. So it's very important for us to measure and then monitor athletes to make sure that they can understand how they're doing, and then also the information go back to the coaches. Let's talk about the athlete status. The way I call it athlete status is to make sure that the physical well-being and then daily status is understood. For example, the physical development is required along with the skill development, meaning that if you don't have a physical component, you cannot develop the skill part. And skill part is easy to understand from coach's standpoint, but maybe not in a physical development. So making sure that the training process is actually helping the physical development, and we can understand that by monitoring. And then also, the daily monitoring is to detect the potential over or under training. And then this is very important that a lot of time they might do too much or too little, and then the training stimulus is not effectively influencing the performance. So making sure that the daily monitoring is done to understand how they're doing on daily basis. We often get asked by coaches why we do monitoring, and then it's important to monitor athletes on daily basis and then periodic basis, because we have to find out what we have to work with. So first one, the baseline information, to identify what is that they should be doing. And this one is very difficult to understand if you don't do the baseline information, what we call that if you don't perform well, and then we need to understand what the reasons are. So the baseline information give us the indication of what they have to do. And then also over time, observing a progression. And then the progression doesn't necessarily mean that it's always improving. We also have to identify some abnormality data, meaning that if the resting heart rate is too high on several days, that would indicate the overuse or fatigue. So improving a physical status or declining a physical status due to fatigue, acute and chronic manner, or muscle loss is very important. So program design is evaluated by those daily monitoring and then also periodic monitoring. So it's always changing depending on how they're doing, how they're progressing, or how they are regressing. So it's important for us to monitor and then make sure that the information goes back to the coaches and the athletes. Let's make some examples on why we monitor. So monitoring with the quantification of training loads are very important. Most of the time, people try to monitor subjectively, just by looking at the person and then say, oh, you look tired. That is a subjective way to measure somebody's fatigue level. But if we quantify with the numbers, we can understand a little bit more about someone's status. So let's say daily monitoring. It has to be easy and quick measure to know the physical well-being. For example, measuring the resting heart rate when they're waking up, or before or after training, we use a session RPE or a soreness chart to make sure that they're not doing too much or too little. And then also, it's important to do the periodic monitoring because we can compare the data from previous to and also the normality of that data. And then we can do the periodic monitoring once a week or once every 10 days or once a month. And we don't have to do this very often, but we need to understand how they're doing in a periodic monitoring. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the different types of monitoring. We'll use examples from daily monitoring and then examples from periodic monitoring, such as jump tests. And then we also talk about the recovery strategy. And then lastly, we're going to cover the importance of a sports nutrition approach for recovery. And then those are very important part of the athlete monitoring process. And then make sure that we all understand how to actually monitor athletes, and then make sure that the coaches understand how those monitoring data is useful for them.